An 86-year-old man sat alone in a quiet park, carefully cutting into a birthday cake meant for 6 people who never showed up. But when a passing biker stopped and uncovered the truth behind those empty chairs, he didn't say a word, because some stories hit too deep for words. Arthur Bennett had always believed that if you prepared properly, people would come. It was a simple idea, one he'd carried through decades of life. From hosting neighborhood barbecues in the 1960s to organizing his daughter's birthday parties with handmade decorations and music playing softly in the background. Back then, people showed up early. They stayed late. They laughed loudly. But today, sitting on a worn wooden bench beside a folding table in the middle of a public park, Arthur adjusted 6 paper plates with trembling hands and tried to convince himself that nothing had changed. The cake was small, vanilla with simple white frosting, the kind you pick up from a grocery store when you don't want to make a fuss. But the way he positioned it, centered perfectly, aligned with the plates, suggested this meant more than he was willing to admit. A single candle stood in the middle, unlit for now, waiting. Arthur checked his watch for the 3rd time in 5 minutes. 2:12 p.m. They were late, but that was all right. People ran late these days. Busy schedules, important lives, things that couldn't be helped. He nodded to himself, as if confirming a truth that needed reinforcement. "They'll come," he whispered under his breath, the words barely audible even to him. A light breeze moved through the park, rustling leaves and carrying distant sounds of traffic, laughter from somewhere far off, a dog barking in the distance. But none of it touched the small bubble Arthur had created around his table. He smoothed out his shirt again, though it was already perfectly pressed, and reached into his jacket pocket to pull out a folded piece of paper. The edges were worn from being handled too many times. He opened it carefully. 6 names written in neat, deliberate handwriting. His daughter, his grandson, a niece, 2 old friends, and one name at the bottom, written slightly smaller than the rest, like he wasn't sure it belonged there anymore. He traced each name with his finger, one by one, as if reminding himself they were real, that they existed beyond memory. "Just running late," he said again, louder this time, like the empty park needed to hear it too. Across the path, a low rumble broke the quiet. A motorcycle rolled by, steady and controlled, the rider glancing briefly toward the old man before continuing on. It wasn't unusual. Bikers passed through this area often, but something about the scene stuck. The table, the cake, the plates. Too many plates for one man. The rider slowed slightly, eyes flicking back again, trying to make sense of it. Arthur didn't notice. He was focused on the candle now, pulling a small lighter from his pocket and flicking it once, twice, before the flame caught. His hands shook just enough to make it difficult, but he managed. The candle lit, a small flame dancing in the afternoon air. He stared at it longer than necessary, his expression caught somewhere between hope and something heavier. He didn't sing, didn't smile, just watched the flame as if it held something he couldn't quite reach. The motorcycle engine faded into the distance, then returned. The rider had turned around. This time, he pulled into the gravel edge of the park and cut the engine completely. Silence settled again, thicker now. Arthur finally looked up as footsteps approached, steady and unhurried. The man who stopped a few feet away wore a leather vest, worn but clean, with patches that told stories Arthur didn't recognize. He wasn't young, but not old either, somewhere in between, with a face that had seen enough to recognize things others missed. He glanced at the table, then at Arthur, then back at the empty chairs. "You expecting a party?" he asked, his voice calm, not mocking, just curious. Arthur blinked, surprised but not offended. "Oh, yes," he said quickly, straightening slightly. "They're just running late." The biker nodded once, his eyes scanning the empty park again before settling back on the old man. "How long you been waiting?" he asked. Arthur hesitated for a fraction of a second, just long enough to matter, then checked his watch again. "Not long," he said. "Only since noon." The biker didn't challenge the answer, didn't point out what was obvious. Instead, he shifted his weight and looked at the bench across from Arthur. "Mind if I sit?" he asked. Arthur seemed to consider it, as if weighing something deeper than the question itself, then nodded. "I'd like that," he said softly. The biker sat down, leaning forward slightly, forearms resting on his knees, his attention fixed not just on Arthur, but on everything around him. The untouched plates, the perfectly placed forks, the cake that hadn't been cut. Arthur reached out and adjusted one of the plates again, though it didn't need adjusting. They don't usually run this late, he said, almost apologetically. The biker glanced at him. Family, he asked. Arthur smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. Yes, he said. Family. He didn't elaborate, and the biker didn't push. Instead, he leaned back slightly, his gaze drifting to the candle still burning steadily in the center of the cake. The flame flickered, bending slightly with the breeze, but never going out. Arthur watched it too, his expression softening into something quieter, something more fragile. I made sure to pick a good day, he added after a moment. Nice weather. Easy parking. Figured that would help. The biker nodded slowly, as if understanding more than Arthur was saying out loud. Yeah, he said. Makes sense. Another silence settled between them, but this one felt different. Not empty, not awkward, just waiting. Arthur folded his hands together, resting them on the table, and looked out across the park, his eyes scanning every movement, every passing figure, every distant sound, searching for something that hadn't arrived yet. And even as the minutes continued to slip by, even as the candle burned lower and the shadows shifted slightly with the afternoon sun, he kept that same quiet belief alive in his chest, that any second now, someone would walk through that park and call his name, that the empty chairs wouldn't stay empty, that this wouldn't be another year spent pretending it didn't matter. The biker had seen a lot of things in his life. Men broken by bad choices, people holding on to pride long after it stopped protecting them. But there was something different about the way Arthur sat there, holding on to hope like it was the last thing keeping him upright. And that's when he decided silence wasn't enough anymore. He leaned forward slightly, resting his arms on the table, his eyes moving from the untouched plates to the folded paper still clutched in Arthur's hand. You mind if I ask you something? He said, voice low, careful not to sound like he was stepping over a line. Arthur looked up, blinking as if pulled out of a thought he'd been stuck in. Not at all, he replied politely, the same practiced warmth he'd probably used his entire life. The biker nodded once. When's the last time you actually saw them? The question didn't land loudly. It didn't need to, but it changed something in the air immediately. Arthur's smile held for a moment, then faded just slightly at the edges. He looked down at the paper in his hand instead of answering, his thumb pressing against one of the names like it might disappear if he didn't hold it in place. They're busy, he said after a pause, his voice softer now, less certain. People have lives. Responsibilities. The biker didn't interrupt. He just watched, the way someone does when they know there's more coming. Arthur let out a quiet breath, almost a sigh, and unfolded the paper again, smoothing it carefully on the table as if the act itself mattered. I sent this out a week ago, he continued. Wrote each one myself. Thought it would feel more personal that way. His eyes traced the names again, slower this time. Didn't want it to feel like just another message they could ignore. The biker leaned in slightly. They reply. Arthur shook his head, quick, almost defensive. No, but that doesn't mean anything, he added immediately. People forget to respond. Happens all the time. The biker's jaw tightened just enough to show he didn't agree, but he didn't argue. Instead, he picked up one of the unused forks, turning it slowly in his fingers. And last year, he asked. Arthur hesitated longer this time. The silence stretched, heavy and uncomfortable, before he finally spoke. Something came up, he said. For all of them. He gave a small, almost apologetic shrug. Bad timing. The biker nodded slowly, but his eyes didn't leave Arthur's face. And the year before that, that one hit. Arthur's shoulders dropped just slightly, the smallest crack in the careful composure he'd been holding together. He looked away, out toward the park again, but this time his eyes didn't scan the path. They just stared. I didn't invite them that year, he admitted quietly. Didn't want to pressure anyone. The biker exhaled through his nose, looking down at the table again. The extra plates, the untouched cake, the candle now burned halfway down. So why this year? He asked softer now. Arthur's fingers tightened together in his lap. Because, he started, then stopped, as if the words didn't want to come out. He swallowed, trying again. Because I thought maybe if I made it official, they'd understand it mattered. He reached out and tapped the invitation lightly. Not just a call, not just a reminder. Something they could hold. The biker didn't say anything right away. He just let that sit there, the weight of it settling into the space between them. Arthur's voice dropped even further when he spoke again. You see, When you get to my age, he said slowly, you start losing things without realizing it at first. A friend stops calling. Another one moves away. Someone gets sick. Someone doesn't come back. His eyes flickered briefly toward the empty chairs. And eventually, you look around and realize the room got quiet. The biker shifted slightly in his seat, something about that line heading deeper than he expected. Arthur let out a small, almost humorless chuckle. I told myself it wasn't like that, he continued. Told myself my family was just busy, that they'd show up when it mattered. He paused, his gaze dropping to the cake again. So I picked today. The biker leaned forward again, elbows on the table now, fully engaged. Why today? Arthur hesitated, then gave a faint smile that didn't quite hold. Because it's my birthday, he said simply. 86. The number hung there for a moment. The biker let out a slow breath. That's not something people forget, he said quietly. Arthur didn't respond right away. Instead, he reached out and adjusted the candle slightly, even though it didn't need adjusting. You'd be surprised what people forget when you're not in front of them anymore, he said. The biker's expression hardened just a little, not at Arthur, but at the situation, at the unseen people who should have been sitting in those chairs. You call them today, he asked. Arthur shook his head again. No, he said. I didn't want to remind them. The biker frowned slightly. Why not? Arthur looked up at him then, and for the first time, there was no smile at all, just something raw and honest. Because if they only come because I asked again, he said, voice barely above a whisper, then they didn't really choose to come. That landed hard. The biker leaned back slowly, absorbing it, his eyes drifting once more to the empty seats that suddenly felt louder than anything else in the park. Arthur followed his gaze and nodded faintly, as if acknowledging something unspoken. I know how it looks, he added. An old man sitting alone with a cake. He gave a small shrug. But I thought, maybe this time would be different. The biker looked back at him, studying his face, the quiet hope still clinging there despite everything. And if they don't come? He asked. Arthur didn't answer immediately. He stared at the candle, now burning low, the flame smaller but still steady. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, but there was something fragile underneath it. Then I suppose, he said slowly, I'll try again next year. The biker didn't speak after that. Not because he didn't have something to say, but because for the first time in a long while, he didn't trust himself to say it without letting something show he wasn't ready to show. So he went silent, completely silent. And Arthur, misreading that silence as just another person quietly stepping back out of his life, nodded to himself as if he understood. Arthur had learned, over the years, how to read silence, and the biker's silence felt familiar, like the kind people gave when they didn't know what to say before they eventually excused themselves and moved on. So when the man stood up without a word, Arthur simply nodded as if to say he understood, because that was easier than asking someone to stay. Thank you for keeping me company, he said gently, already reaching for the plastic knife as though the moment had passed. The biker didn't respond. He just looked at the table one last time. The 6 plates, the carefully folded invitation, the candle now burned almost to the base, then turned and walked away. No explanation. No goodbye. Just the sound of his boots fading against the gravel path until even that disappeared. Arthur watched him go for a few seconds, his expression calm but distant, then looked back down at the cake. Busy people, he murmured under his breath, not bitter, not angry, just accepting. He took a slow breath, straightened his shoulders, and leaned forward slightly. Well, he said quietly to himself, no sense letting it go to waste. His hand trembled just enough to make the knife press unevenly into the frosting as he began to cut the first slice, the blade dragging through the soft cake with a faint sound that seemed louder than it should have been in the empty park. The candle flickered weakly beside him, its flame bending low, threatening to go out on its own. Arthur paused for a moment, looking at it, then leaned in and blew it out himself. No wish this time. No hesitation. Just a quiet exhale, like closing a door he had kept open for too long. He lifted the slice carefully, placing it onto one of the plates, and sat back again, staring at it as if unsure what came next. That's when he heard it. Faint at first. A low rumble in the distance. He didn't react immediately. Cars passed nearby all the time, but the sound grew louder, deeper, unmistakable. Engines. Not one. Many. Arthur slowly turned his head toward the road that curved along the edge of the park, his brow furrowing slightly as the noise approached, building into something that demanded attention. Then they appeared. Motorcycles, one after another, rolling in a long line, chrome catching the sunlight, engines humming in a steady, unified rhythm. Arthur blinked, confused, watching as they turned into the park entrance and slowed, the formation tightening as they approached the open space where he sat. At the front was the same biker, the one who had just left. He guided his bike to a stop a few feet from the table, cut the engine, and swung his leg off in one smooth motion. Behind him, more riders followed, parking in a loose semicircle around Arthur's setup, engines shutting off one by one until the air fell quiet again. But this time, it wasn't empty. Arthur looked from one face to another, his confusion deepening. I think you've got the wrong place," he said, his voice unsure now. The biker stepped forward, removing his gloves slowly, his expression steady but softer than before. "No," he said. "We're exactly where we're supposed to be." Arthur's eyes widened slightly as a few of the others began moving closer, not crowding him, just filling the space that had been empty minutes ago. One of them picked up the extra plates without asking, handing them out. Another reached into a saddlebag and pulled out a lighter, relighting the candle with a careful flick. The small flame returned, stronger this time, standing upright despite the breeze. Arthur looked at it, then back at the biker. "What is this?" he asked quietly. The biker pulled out one of the chairs and sat down across from him again, just like before. But this time, he wasn't alone. "It's a birthday," he said simply. Arthur shook his head slightly, overwhelmed, his hands resting uncertainly on the edge of the table. "But you don't even know me," he said. A few of the riders exchanged glances, faint smiles appearing, but no one laughed. The biker leaned forward just a little. "You were sitting alone on your birthday," he said. That told us enough. Something in Arthur's expression shifted then, something fragile giving way under the weight of what was happening. He looked around again, really looked this time. These weren't people passing through. They had stopped. They had stayed. For him. "You came back," he said, almost to himself. The biker nodded once. Didn't feel right leaving it the way it was. For a moment, Arthur didn't speak. His throat tightened, and he swallowed hard, trying to steady himself. One of the riders, an older woman with silver hair tucked under a bandana, gently nudged a plate toward him. "Go on," she said warmly. "You can't have a birthday without the candle." Arthur let out a shaky breath, his eyes glistening now as he looked at the small flame flickering in front of him. His hands trembled as he reached toward the table, fingers brushing the edge of the cake again. I don't know what to say," he admitted. The biker shook his head slightly. "You don't have to say anything." He leaned back and glanced at the others, giving a small nod. And just like that, without coordination, without rehearsal, they started singing. It wasn't perfect. Some voices were rough, others off-key, a few coming in too early or too late, but it was real, loud, unapologetic, filling the park in a way that pushed back against every empty moment that had come before it. Arthur froze at first, his eyes moving from face to face, disbelief written across every line of his expression. Then something broke, not in a painful way, but in a way that let something out he had been holding in for years. His lips trembled, and a quiet laugh escaped him, mixed with something dangerously close to tears. By the time they reached the final line, his shoulders were shaking slightly, his eyes fixed on the candle, as if it meant something entirely different now. "Make a wish," someone said softly. Arthur hesitated, just for a second. Then he leaned forward and closed his eyes. This time, he didn't rush it, didn't treat it like a formality. Whatever he wished for, he let himself feel it fully before opening his eyes again and blowing out the candle in one steady breath. The flame disappeared, a thin trail of smoke rising into the air, but the silence that followed wasn't empty anymore. It was full, warm, alive. Arthur sat back slowly, looking around at the people now filling every seat, every space that had once been waiting for someone else. And for the first time that day, he didn't look toward the path anymore. He didn't wait, because he wasn't alone. Not anymore.